Mom warned me every birthday, don't ruin the photos. So when my stepfather's hand struck my face that morning, I held still. I smiled. Hours later, the fresh bruise on my cheek was hidden under foundation. My name is Claire Monroe. I am 32 years old, and for half of my life, I have been an archivist of my own pain. It is a quiet, meticulous job, one that requires a steady hand and an unblinking eye. The archive is not stored in a climate-controlled vault, but in the digital ether, and in a heavy fireproof box tucked into the furthest corner of my closet. It is a collection of smiles, each one a specimen pinned under glass, catalogued by date, occasion, and the precise nature of the lie it was telling. The collection began in Milford, Ohio, a town that felt less like a place on a map and more like a sealed terrarium. Milford specialized in neatly trimmed lawns, Sunday church services, and the silent, communal agreement to never look too closely at the cracks in your neighbor's foundation. Our house was the model exhibit. My memories of childhood are framed by the click and whir of a Polaroid camera, followed by the slow chemical fade-in of a perfect family moment. And before every click, there was my mother's voice, a soft, urgent hum against my ear. Don't ruin the photos, Claire. It was the family mantra, the 11th commandment. It was whispered as she straightened the satin sash on my birthday dress, hissed as she wiped a smudge of frosting from my cheek, and pleaded with her eyes from across the room when she saw my lower lip begin to tremble. It was a strange sort of gospel, the belief that if the image was perfect, the reality could be ignored. A smile in my mother's world was not an expression of joy. It was a form of spackle meant to fill the holes and smooth over the blemishes before the flash went off. She believed, or needed to believe, that a photograph could hold a moment hostage, forcing it to be happy forever. She never seemed to understand that a photograph doesn't capture happiness, it only captures light. And in every one of those captured squares of light, he was there. Rick, my stepfather. He was a master of staging, a director of the family portrait. He was always positioned directly behind me, a looming shadow in a crisp polo shirt. His hands, large and calloused from his work as a construction foreman, would rest on my shoulders. It was meant to look paternal, protective, a father framing his little girl. But it never felt that way. His grip was always just a fraction too tight, his thumbs pressing into the soft part of my shoulders. A subtle assertion of ownership. It was a pose that said, she is mine. This smile is mine. This entire scene belongs to me. I can still feel the weight of it. The specific pressure that was both a physical restraint and a silent warning. In the photos, his face is a mask of jovial pride, the kind of man who would show these pictures to his co-workers, boasting about his perfect family, his beautiful stepdaughter. They would see a happy man. I would see the warden, his hand clamped on his most prized possession. Year by year, I became a better actor. At 7, I learned to bite the inside of my cheek to stop the tears. At 10, I mastered the art of breathing through a smile, taking in short, shallow sips of air so my chest wouldn't heave. By 13, I could hold a grin for the entire duration of Happy Birthday, through the cutting of the cake, and until the last flashbulb faded, the spot still dancing in my vision. Only then, in the privacy of my own room, with the door locked, would I let the mask dissolve. The silence of the house downstairs, filled with the low murmur of adults and the clinking of glasses, was the soundtrack to my silent sobs. I would cry without a sound, a skill learned by children in houses with thin walls. It was a performance in 2 acts, the public smile and the private collapse. I was perfecting my role, becoming the daughter he wanted to photograph. The year I turned 16, I decided to improvise. It wasn't a grand rebellion. It was a small, quiet thing. Rick was trying to arrange us for the annual cake-cutting portrait, his hand already descending toward my shoulder. "Can Mom stand here this year?" I asked. My voice was level, polite, but the question was a fissure in the smooth surface of our ritual. I didn't look at him, but I felt the atmosphere in the room instantly drop 20 degrees. The small talk among our few guests faltered. My mother's hands froze over the box of matches she was holding. The air cracked. A percussive boom exploded against the side of my head, and the world went momentarily white, replaced by a shrill, unending ringing in my left ear. It was a sound so loud it was a silence, erasing the party, the music, my own thoughts. Through the high-pitched siren of my own nerve endings, I could vaguely register the stunned stillness of the room, the sharp intake of my mother's breath. He didn't say a word. He simply adjusted his grip on my shoulder, harder this time, and pulled me back into position. "Smile," he commanded, his voice a low growl meant only for me. The camera flashed, capturing the image forever, a smiling man, a smiling girl, and a ringing in her ear that would not fade for a solid week. Later that night, my mother came into my room. She didn't turn on the light. She sat on the edge of my bed, her form a soft silhouette against the hallway glare. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't acknowledge the invisible hum that was still vibrating in my skull. She just smoothed the blanket over my legs, her touch light as a moth's wing. "Don't make things worse, Claire," she whispered, her voice thick with a sorrow that I now understand was not for me, but for the fragility of her own peace. "Please, just don't make it worse." That was the moment I understood that my mother was not my ally. She was a fellow prisoner, and my attempts at rattling the cage only made her own confinement more terrifying. She had chosen her method of survival, pretending the cage wasn't there. From that day forward, I fell silent. I played my part with chilling perfection. I smiled on cue, stood where I was told, and never again questioned the director. But a different kind of rebellion was taking root in the dark. I stopped throwing away the Polaroids after the party was over. I began to keep them. The first one was the picture from my 16th birthday. I hid it between the pages of a book I never read. Then came the one from my 17th, where the shadow of a bruise on my arm was almost, but not quite, visible beneath the sleeve of my dress. I kept the receipts for the expensive, full-coverage concealer I had to buy from the drugstore. I kept the medical bill from the time I fell down the stairs and sprained my wrist, the bill Rick paid in cash, his generosity a performance for the emergency room staff. My collection grew. Each photograph was a piece of evidence. Each receipt, a corroborating document. I wasn't just hoarding memories, I was building a case. An idea formed in the quiet of my mind, a cold, hard diamond of a thought. If he wanted photos to build his facade, to prove his worth to the world, then I would give him photos. I would give him an entire library of them. He was so proud of the images. These flat, glossy lies. He never once looked at the eyes of the girl in the picture. He only saw his own reflection as a good man, a family man, smiling back at him. He couldn't see that I was no longer just the subject of the photograph, I was becoming its curator. And in the silence of my room, staring at the smiling girl with the haunted eyes from my 16th birthday, I made a vow. It wasn't a loud, dramatic promise. It was a cold, quiet certainty that settled deep in my bones. One day, these photos will speak for me. One day, the smiles he manufactured will curdle and tell the truth. One day, the very evidence of his perfect life will be the architecture of his ruin. The pictures themselves will turn on him. That day, the one I had been preparing for since I was a teenager, began just like all the others. It began with the pretense of a celebration, an invitation to my own birthday party. It began with the need for a perfect photo. The phone call came on the morning of my 32nd birthday. It was a Tuesday. I was in my clean, quiet apartment in Columbus, watching the dust motes dance in a sliver of sunlight. A cup of black coffee warming my hands. I hadn't planned on doing anything. 32 felt like just another number, another day to add to the calendar. Then my phone buzzed and my mother's name lit up the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering. A small, pointless act of control. Her voice was different. It had a forced, brittle brightness that I knew was pasted over a tremor. Claire, happy birthday. Sweetheart, hi, Mom. Listen, Rick and I were thinking we'd love for you to come home, just for dinner. He wants to have a real family celebration. He's already got a cake. Home. She always called it that, as if the word itself could magic away the truth of the place. I pictured the small house in Milford, the air thick with the ghosts of every smile I'd ever faked. The last time I had been there was for Christmas, an 8-hour ordeal of strained pleasantries and careful navigation around Rick's moods. The thought of going back made my stomach clench. I don't know, Mom. It's a bit of a drive for just a dinner. Please, she said, and the brittle brightness cracked. Underneath was the sound I had been waiting for. The sound that told me this was not about me. It was the thin, frayed edge of fear. Just come, Claire, please. Something was wrong. My mother only used that tone when Rick was on a precipice. When the delicate ecosystem of her life was threatening to collapse, my presence was required as a buffer, a lightning rod. For 16 years, that had been my primary function in the family. I had hoped foolishly that moving 2 hours away would be enough to tender my resignation, but my role, it seemed, was a lifetime appointment. Okay, I said, my own voice a monotone. I'll be there around 6. I drove the familiar highway with the windows down, letting the late autumn air whip through the car. It smelled of dying leaves and damp earth. Every mile closer to Milford felt like a step back in time. I passed the same faded billboards, the same lonely farmhouses, the same skeletal trees clawing at the grey sky. It was a journey into the heart of my archive, the landscape where all the evidence was collected. But this time was different. I was not the subject of the experiment anymore. I was the scientist. Returning to the lab to run one final, definitive test. Before I left my apartment, I had slipped my phone into a small, unobtrusive stand. I had cleared its memory. I had tested the video camera's audio pickup from across a room. I was prepared. The house looked exactly the same, right down to the slightly crooked shutter on the upstairs window. As I walked up the path, I could hear Rick's booming laugh through the front door. It was a sound designed for performance, to let the neighbors know what a happy, vibrant home this was. I took a deep breath, composed my face into a mask of neutral politeness, and walked in. The air inside was a cloying mixture of competing scents, the sugary vanilla of a store-bought sheet cake, the sharp, yeasty smell of beer, and the heavy aroma of the whiskey Rick favored. It was the signature perfume of every celebration I had ever endured. He was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, a glass in his hand. He was thicker in the middle than I remembered, his face flushed, but the eyes were the same, small, watchful, constantly assessing for weakness. There she is, he bellowed, spreading his arms wide. Still my little girl, huh? I did not walk into the offered embrace. I stopped just inside the kitchen, placing my purse on the small table by the door. Not for long, I said, my voice light, almost a joke. But it wasn't. It was a statement of fact. His smile tightened at the edges for a fraction of a second before the jovial mask was back in place. My mother bustled out from the dining room, wiping her hands on an apron. She looked tired. The lines around her eyes were deeper, her smile as fragile as a robin's egg. She hugged me, a quick, papery rustle of a hug. I'm so glad you came, she whispered, her eyes flicking toward Rick. The first hour was a master class in avoidance. We talked about the weather. We talked about my job at the insurance firm, a topic Rick found endlessly boring, but pretended to be interested in for the sake of appearances. I answered in brief, non-committal sentences. I was a grey rock, offering no surface for him to grab onto, no emotional reaction to feed his ego. I could feel his frustration mounting. He was used to being the sun in our tiny solar system, the gravitational center around which my mother and I were forced to orbit. My placid indifference was a disruption to the laws of his universe. I need to get the candles, my mother announced suddenly, her voice high and cheerful. Can't have a birthday cake without candles. She scurried out of the kitchen, her departure sucking all the manufactured warmth out of the room. The silence she left behind was heavy. Charged, Rick took a slow swallow from his whiskey glass, his eyes never leaving my face. He set the glass down on the counter with a deliberate, hard click. He took a step toward me, closing the small gap of neutral territory between us. He was close enough now that I could smell the liquor on his breath. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, a tone he used when he wanted to remind me of the power he held. Still taking pictures of everything. It was a jab, a reference to the old disposable cameras of my childhood, the hobby he had always belittled. He meant it as a dismissal, a way to put me back in my place as the silly, sentimental girl. He had no idea how close to the truth he was. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I met his gaze, my own eyes as steady and clear as glass. I let the silence stretch for a beat, letting the weight of his question hang in the air. Then I gave him my answer. You'll wish I didn't. The change in him was instantaneous. It was like a switch being flipped. The jovial host persona shorting out, revealing the raw, volatile wiring beneath. The blood rushed to his face, turning it a mottled, ugly red, his jaw clenched. For 16 years, I had lived in fear of this exact moment, the sudden, violent pivot from feigned good humor to rage. But now, all I felt was a cold, clinical calm. The final piece of my experiment was falling into place. His hand came up so fast it was a blow of motion. The sound was a flat, wet crack that seemed to suck all the air from the room. My head snapped to the side, my hair flying across my face. A familiar fiery sting bloomed across my cheek, and the metallic taste of blood instantly filled my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my lip. Just then, my mother rushed back into the kitchen, a small box of birthday candles in her hand. She froze in the doorway, her face a canvas of horror, but the words that came out of her mouth were not, "Are you okay?" "What have you done?" she shrieked, her voice thin and desperate. "Stop, Rick, stop. We need the photos." That was it. The moment of absolute clarity. Her first instinct, her most primal fear, was not for her daughter's safety, but for the destruction of the illusion. The integrity of the photograph was more important than the integrity of my skin. Slowly, deliberately, I straightened up. I raised a hand to my mouth and wiped away the small trickle of blood that had escaped the corner of my lip. I looked at the smear of red on my fingertips. Then I looked from my mother's terrified face to Rick's panting, furious one. I let them think they saw weakness. I let them see the tears welling in my eyes, the tremble in my hand. I let them believe they had won, that the old pattern had held, that the girl had once again been put in her place. "Yeah," I said, my voice quiet but perfectly clear. "We do." They didn't see my other hand, the one that had just minutes before propped my phone up in its stand on the small kitchen table, angled perfectly toward the center of the room. They didn't know that when I'd walked in, I had pressed record. They thought this was just another ugly, hidden moment, another secret to be smoothed over with concealer and a forced smile. They had no idea that this time there was a silent, impartial witness. This time there was a file being created, time-stamped and saved. A perfect high-definition recording of it all, the flat, unforgiving kitchen light, the bright, shocking red of my blood, and the blow of his hand captured forever. The silence that followed my mother's shriek was thick and suffocating. It was a vacuum, and into that vacuum, Rick's bravado rushed back in. He straightened his polo shirt, ran a hand through his thinning hair, and composed his face back into the mask of the benevolent patriarch. The violence was over. The performance was back on. My mother, pale and trembling, scurried to the sink to run a glass of water, her movements jerky and bird-like. I remained perfectly still, a statue in the center of the kitchen, feeling the thrum of adrenaline in my veins and the slow, deep ache beginning to radiate from my jaw. I did not touch my face again. The evidence was there. It needed no further confirmation. Well, Rick boomed, his voice unnaturally loud, shattering the last of the silence. Time for the main event. He disappeared into the dining room and returned a moment later, bearing the cake. He held it aloft like a trophy, a triumphant offering. He placed it on the kitchen island with a theatrical flourish, a grand centerpiece for our fractured celebration. And there I was, 10 years old, grinning from the glossy, edible surface. My hair was in pigtails, a front tooth was missing, and my eyes were bright with a genuine, uncomplicated happiness that felt like a relic from another civilization. The girl on the cake knew nothing of what was to come. She existed in a flat, sugary world of birthday parties that was still about joy, of smiles that were not yet a survival mechanism. Looking at her, while the coppery taste of my own blood coated my tongue, created a sense of vertigo, a temporal whiplash that was both nauseating and clarifying. Rick leaned over the cake, admiring his work. The photo had been his idea, a surprise he'd arranged with the local bakery. It was meant to be a sentimental gesture, a callback to simpler times. But now, in the charged air of the kitchen, it was a grotesque parody. It was a statement. He was showing me the girl. He expected me to be smiling, compliant, perpetually 10 years old and under his control. Still perfect, right? The question was aimed at my mother, but his eyes were locked on me. It was a command disguised as a question, forcing us to validate the grotesque tableau he had created, the happy photo, the bleeding lip, the silent, terrified mother. He was daring me to break character, to ruin another photo. My mother, her face ashen, took the cake knife he held out to her. Her hands shook so violently I thought she might drop it. Go on, he urged, his voice hardening. Cut the cake. As her trembling hand brought the knife down, plunging it into the forehead of my 10-year-old self, a single drop of melted red wax slid from one of the cheap-lit candles. It trickled down the sugary curve of my printed cheek, a slow crimson tear, coming to rest right at the corner of my smiling mouth, a perfect, accidental stain of blood on an image of innocence. The symbolism was so potent, so brutally on the nose that I almost laughed. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. Then came the cameras. My mother's phone first, her hand still unsteady as she framed the shot of Rick standing proudly behind the mutilated cake. Then his own phone, which he handed to her so he could pose. One hand on the knife, the other descending to its customary place on my shoulder. Come on, Claire, get in the picture, he ordered. I moved into position, a wooden doll being arranged for a diorama. The heat from his body felt toxic. The weight of his hand on my shoulder was heavier than it had ever been. Smile bigger, he commanded, leaning his head close to mine, his whiskey-sour breath hot against my cheek. Let's get a good one for the album. And so I smiled. I stretched my lips over my teeth, ignoring the sharp protest from my split lip, the deep ache in my bruised cheek. I tilted my head just so. I looked directly into the lens of my mother's phone, and I gave him the most brilliant, hollow, perfect smile I had ever produced. It was a masterpiece of deceit, a work of art honed over 2 decades of practice. As the flash went off, I saw for a split second in the dark reflection of a wine glass on the counter the tiny winking light of my own phone's camera, still propped up, still recording, a silent, faithful witness to the entire pageant. He made us take a dozen more, from every angle, with me, with my mother, with both of us. Each click of the shutter was a fresh wave of nausea. In my mind, I was already cataloguing the images. I was dragging and dropping files. Every flat, smiling photo he captured, I stored away in the mental folder I had maintained for years, the one labeled evidence for a family. The two words had long ago become synonymous. After the photo session was complete, and he was satisfied that the illusion of a happy family had been sufficiently documented, I excused myself. I went to the small downstairs bathroom and locked the door. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't need to. I knew what I would see. Instead, I took out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I scrolled through the photos he had insisted my mother airdrop to me. For my memories, I chose one. It was a close-up, one where he had demanded I look happier. My smile was wide, stretched, the lighting was harsh, and if you looked closely, you could just make out the slight puffiness along my cheekbone. The careful, thick application of foundation that didn't quite match my skin tone. It was an image that looked perfectly normal at first glance, but deeply unsettling on the second. I opened an old, dormant social media account, one I hadn't touched in years. Its followers, a random collection of high school acquaintances and distant relatives from Milford. I uploaded the photo and under it, I typed a single sentence, "Some smiles take years to heal." I hit post. Then I turned off my phone, tucked it into my purse, and walked back out to the party, a guest at my own execution. Over the next hour, as I picked at a slice of cake I couldn't eat and listened to Rick hold court about local politics, something was happening in the digital world. A small stone had been tossed into a still pond. A few likes became a dozen. A comment appeared. "Are you okay?" Then another. "Claire, what does this mean?" Then the shares started. People from my past. People who knew Rick, who had been to these parties, who had seen the perfect family photos year after year. The caption was a key, unlocking a suspicion they had perhaps held but never voiced. Within a few hours, the post had escaped the confines of my small network. Strangers were commenting, hundreds of them, their words a rising chorus under the photo of my strained, painful smile. "Her eyes look so sad. That's not a real smile. Who did this to you?" Rick, meanwhile, was oblivious. He was on his fourth whiskey, laughing, expansive, the king in his castle. He was so confident in his control of the narrative, so certain of the power of his staged photographs, that he never imagined the images could be read in a different language. He believed he was the director, the author, the one who decided what the picture meant. He saw a cake, a symbol of his magnanimity and control. He didn't see the tiny pinprick lens I had painstakingly inserted into a decorative swirl of black buttercream after the baker had finished. Its unblinking eye aimed directly at his face. He didn't know that my birthday cake was a Trojan horse. He had no idea that as he leaned over it, basking in the glow of the candles, a second video file was being recorded, capturing a crystal-clear close-up shot of his face, contorted with rage just moments before, now slack with drunken pride. He didn't know that everyone was about to see him cut the cake with the very same hand that had, less than an hour earlier, tried to silence me for good. I said my goodbyes with the practiced ease of a diplomat leaving a hostile nation. A chaste, airlight hug for my mother, her body rigid with unspoken panic. A cool, level nod for Rick, who was too deep in his whiskey to register the finality of the gesture. He just grunted, waving a dismissive hand. My purse felt unnaturally heavy as I walked to the door, a satisfying, dense weight against my hip. Inside, nestled between my wallet and a paperback novel, was a small black solid-state hard drive. My archive, the sum of my life's secret work. The drive out of Milford that night was different. The familiar roads, usually conduits of dread, felt like an escape route. The cool night air rushing through the open window smelled clean, washing away the cloying, sweet scent of cake and deceit. For the first time, leaving that house didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like an advance. I was not fleeing a scene of the crime, I was a forensic specialist. Leaving with the evidence secured, back in the sterile, quiet of my own apartment. The world of that house seemed a million miles away. Here, everything was in its place. The books on my shelves were arranged by subject and author. The pens on my desk were aligned in a neat row. It was a space of order, a sanctuary built to counteract a lifetime of chaos. I made a pot of strong black coffee, the bitter aroma a welcome antidote to the memory of birthday cake. Then I sat at my desk, the city lights of Columbus, a distant, glittering web outside my window, and I began my work. I slid the hard drive from my purse. It was small, no bigger than a credit card, but it held 15 years of meticulously curated truth. I plugged it into my laptop with a soft, definitive click. The drive whirred to life, and a single folder appeared on my desktop, a Monroe case file. My professional life had, in a strange way, been the perfect training for this moment. For the past 6 years, I had worked as a senior image and data analyst for a large insurance company. I spent my days staring at pixels, searching for the subtle tells of a lie. I could spot the digital artifacting that proved a security photo had been doctored. I knew how to enhance a darkened video frame to reveal the license plate of a car fleeing an accident. I could cross-reference the metadata of a digital photo with weather reports and sun positioning to prove it wasn't taken when the claimant said it was. My job was to deconstruct fabricated realities, to follow the digital breadcrumbs back to the unvarnished and often ugly truth. I was paid to be meticulous, dispassionate, and suspicious. Rick had inadvertently financed the education of his own prosecutor. I opened the case file. Inside were 15 folders, each labeled with a year. I started with the new acquisitions from the evening. First, I transferred the video file from my phone, the one that had been recording from the kitchen table. I named it B-Day 32 Slap Angle 1 Raw MP4. I watched it once, my face impassive. I was no longer the subject. I was an analyst. I noted the timestamp of the impact. I noted the clarity of the audio, as my mother's voice pierced the silence, prioritizing the photo over the person. Then I retrieved the tiny waterproof camera, from where I'd hidden it in my purse, after discreetly plucking it from the half-eaten cake. I downloaded its contents, 32 close-up angle 2 cake MP4. The quality was remarkable. It captured a perfect, damning close-up of Rick's face, his features slack with pride as he held the knife. The background audio contained the same sharp slap, and ensuing dialogue from the first video. The two files synced perfectly. With the new evidence secured and backed up to a secondary drive, I turned to the archive itself. It was time to build the final, comprehensive timeline. I began to construct a narrative, not with words, but with data. I opened folder by folder, year by year, and began the methodical process of labeling and cross-referencing. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady, practiced rhythm. An image from my high school graduation, me in a cap and gown, smiling brightly. Rick's arm is around me. My left arm, however, is held stiffly at my side. I paired the image with a scanned doctor's note from 2 days prior, excusing me from gym class due to a severely bruised rotator cuff. I merged the two files into a single PDF. A series of photos from a family vacation to Florida when I was 20. In the first few, I am laughing on the beach. In the last one, taken on the final day, I am wearing a long-sleeved sweater despite the 80 degrees heat, and my smile doesn't reach my eyes. I placed it alongside a scanned receipt for a tube of arnica cream, purchased at a CVS near our hotel, timestamped the evening before the photo was taken. The file label was simple: Florida Vacation Smile Sweater Receipt PDF. A photo of a beautiful, expensive laptop he bought me for my first year of college. Then a repair bill from the University Tech Store 6 weeks later, citing impact damage to the screen and chassis. My system was precise, relentless. Gift laptop impact damage PDF. Apology flowers black eye PDF. Christmas bonus sprained ankle PDF. Each file was a chapter heading in a long, silent story. Each label, smile, bruise, gift, hospital, was a testament to the suffocating duality of my existence. I worked for hours. The only sounds were the quiet click of my keyboard and the hum of the laptop. I felt no rage, no sorrow. I felt only the cold, clear focus of a cartographer mapping the borders of a hidden country of pain. Finally, the timeline was complete. A 15-year chain of evidence, irrefutable, with the night's high-definition video as its closing statement. I took the file, B-Day 32 Slap Angle 1 Raw MP4, and uploaded it to a secure, anonymous cloud storage service. The progress bar crept across the screen, a slow green line sealing his fate. I set the permissions to private, accessible only via a unique, unguessable link. I copied the URL to my clipboard. I opened a new, clean email. I typed my mother's email address into the recipient field. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking in the empty message body. What was there to say? What words could possibly contain the weight of this moment? I realized with a sudden, stark clarity that none were needed. The evidence could speak for itself. I pasted the link into the email. Nothing else. No subject line, no greeting, no explanation. Just the link. A quiet digital bomb delivered to her inbox. I clicked send. The email vanished from my outbox, and the world held its breath. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked to the window. Looking out at the sleeping city, I didn't know what I expected. A sudden sense of relief, a surge of triumph. Instead, I felt a profound stillness, the quiet hum of a machine that has just completed its primary function. I had spent more than a decade building this archive, and now the first piece of it was deployed. There was nothing left to do, but wait for the detonation. It took almost exactly 1 hour. My phone, sitting face down on the coffee table, began to vibrate. Her name glowed on the screen. I let it vibrate for a full minute before I picked it up. My own heartbeat steady. Calm. I answered and said nothing. Silence on the other end, then a ragged, shuddering breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was a ghost, a sound I had never heard before. It was the sound of a world completely and irrevocably shattered. Claire, what have you done? I turned away from the window, my gaze falling on the hard drive, still connected to my laptop. The little blue light was blinking, a steady, rhythmic pulse. Just save the photos, Mom, I said, my voice as cool and calm as the glass of the window pane, like you always asked. The line was silent for a long time. I could hear her breathing, shallow and broken. I could hear the sound of a life of denial collapsing in on itself. Then there was a long, slow exhalation. It was not a sigh of anger or of sadness. It was a sigh of utter, absolute defeat. It was the sound of a confirmation, the sound of surrender. Then the line went dead. I slept that night, a deep, dreamless sleep that felt like the shutting down of a machine that had been running on high alert for 2 decades. I woke to the pale grey light of Wednesday morning, feeling not rested, but reset. The world seemed sharper, the colors more defined. The hum of the city outside my window was just a sound, not a threat. For the first time, I could remember, I didn't wake up with the familiar low-grade dread that had been my constant companion since childhood. I felt nothing, a blank, clean slate. I went to work. The office was an oasis of beige and muted blues, a world of spreadsheets and actuarial tables where every risk was calculated and every variable accounted for. I sat at my desk, the familiar click of my keyboard a comforting rhythm. I analyzed a claim involving a suspicious warehouse fire, enlarging security footage, cross-referencing inventories, my mind sinking into the cool, clean logic of the task. It was an ordinary day. For a few hours, I almost forgot that I had lit a fuse and walked away. That a carefully constructed life in a small town in Ohio was about to be vaporized. The call came just after lunch. It wasn't my direct line, but the main number for my department, routed through the front desk. The caller ID said, HR. My stomach gave a small, nervous flutter. Human Resources only ever called for 2 reasons, mandatory benefit seminars, or because you were in trouble. Claire Monroe speaking. Hi, Claire. It's Brenda from HR, the voice said, with the chipper, relentlessly upbeat tone of someone whose job it is to handle difficult conversations with practiced neutrality. Sorry to bother you. I just have a rather unusual question for you. Okay, I said slowly, leaning back in my chair. There was a hesitant pause, the sound of someone choosing their words with extreme care. Claire, are you by any chance trending on TikTok? The question was so utterly bizarre, so disconnected from the sterile reality of my cubicle, that I thought I had misheard. I'm sorry, what? TikTok, she repeated, the name of the app sounding alien in her corporate speak. There's a video circulating. It's getting a lot of attention. And it looks a lot like you. A cold, heavy feeling started in my gut and spread through my limbs. I hadn't posted the video. I had only sent the private link to my mother. The leak was not my doing, which meant it was hers. In her panic, she must have forwarded it, shared it, trying to get advice or help, and in doing so, had unleashed it. She had dropped the bomb herself. I'll have to look into it, Brenda, I said, my voice remarkably steady. Please do, she said, her tone shifting to one of genuine concern. The company has resources, Claire. If you need anything, my door is always open. The moment I hung up, my hands started to shake. I opened a new browser tab, my fingers fumbling on the keys as I typed the name of the app. I didn't have an account, but it didn't matter. The algorithm, in its omniscient, terrifying way, already knew what I was looking for. It was the 3rd video on the main page. The thumbnail was a slightly blurry still of my face caught mid-sentence in my mother's kitchen. Above it, in bold white text, was the title, She Smiled Through Every Hit. The username was anonymous, a random string of numbers. I clicked. The video was a crudely edited, 1-minute clip of my masterpiece, B-Day 32 Slap Angle 1 Raw MP4. It started with Rick's taunt, still my little girl, her, and my quiet reply. It showed the tense, silent moments, his approach, and then the sharp, ugly crack of the slap. It lingered on my stunned face, then cut to my mother's shriek, we need the photos. And it ended on the final, damning image. Me wiping blood from my lip. My eyes looking directly into the camera as I said, yeah, we do. Underneath the video, the view count was ticking upwards like a taximeter in hell. 2.1 million. The comments were a roaring, torrential flood. A digital flash mob that had materialized in my kitchen. OMG. His face when she says that the mom cares more about the pictures than her daughter getting hit. This is the coldest revenge I've ever seen. Someone find this man. I felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life. My pain, my secrets, my meticulously collected evidence had been turned into content. It had been consumed, judged, and reshared millions of times, all while I was analyzing fire damage reports. The irony was suffocating. My corporate phone rang, startling me so badly I almost dropped it. The screen displayed a number I hadn't saved but knew by heart, Milford, Ohio. I let it ring once, twice, then answered, putting it on speaker. A scream, distorted by rage and panic, erupted from the phone. "What did you do?" It was Rick. The booming, confident voice was gone, replaced by a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "Take it down. Take it down right now. You're destroying this family. You're destroying everything." I leaned forward, my voice low, calm, and clear. Each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into the chaos of his hysteria. "You already did." I disconnected the call. I blocked his number. The silence that followed was more satisfying than any screaming match could ever have been. A few minutes later, my personal phone buzzed with a text message. It was my mother. Her approach was different. Not rage, but a desperate, cloying appeal to a sense of familial duty I no longer possessed. "Claire, you have to stop this. People from town are calling the house. Your sister Emily is getting messages at school. They are saying horrible things about her, about our family. She's just a kid. Please don't drag everyone else into this. Think about your sister. Emily, my younger sister, 17 and still trapped in that house, still living under his roof." For a moment, a pang of guilt, ancient and reflexive, shot through me. My mother knew exactly which strings to pull, which leverage to apply. For years, the threat of making things worse for others had been enough to keep me in line. But as I sat there staring at her message, something shifted. I thought of Emily, and I wasn't filled with guilt, but with a cold, hard anger. My mother was using her as a shield, just as she had used my smiles, my silence, my compliance. She was asking me to protect the family's reputation at the expense of the truth, the same bargain she had made with herself for 20 years. I didn't text her back. Words were no longer necessary. I opened the video file on my laptop. I scrubbed forward to the exact frame. 191,402. The moment of impact. It was a perfect, horrifying tableau, Rick's hand, a blow of motion, my head snapping to the side. And there, in the background, perfectly in focus, was my mother. Her face was a mask of shock, her hand halfway to her mouth, her body frozen. She was watching. She was a witness. I took a screenshot. I opened the image and cropped it, cutting out the extraneous details of the kitchen, focusing only on the triangle of our three bodies, the abuser, the victim, and the witness, the perpetrator, the evidence, and the accomplice. I attached the image to a new message to my mother and hit send. No text, no explanation, just the photo, the truth in a single frame. I set the phone down. I stared out the window at the anonymous cityscape, and as I sat there, a profound realization washed over me. A truth so simple and so powerful it felt like the final gear of a great machine clicking into place. My mother's silence had never been passive. It was not a quiet retreat from a battle she couldn't win. It was an action. It was a choice. Every time she had told me to be quiet, to not make things worse, to just smile for the photo, she was making a choice. She had chosen his comfort over my safety. She had chosen the illusion of peace over the reality of my pain. Her silence was not a shield. It was a weapon she had used to enforce his reign. Her silence was complicity. And with that final, devastating understanding, the weight I had been carrying my entire life, the heavy cloak of guilt I had worn for so long, simply dissolved. The guilt for not being a happier child, the guilt for being the source of the tension in the house. The guilt for finally breaking the silence. It was all gone. For the first time, I felt nothing but the clean, sharp, exhilarating chill of freedom. The digital storm I had unleashed did not abate. It grew. My phone became a useless brick of buzzing notifications, a portal to a world that was dissecting my life in real time. I put it on silent and left it in a drawer. The noise was irrelevant. The viral moment was a chaotic, blunt instrument. What I needed now was a scalpel. The opportunity arrived on Thursday morning, not as a notification, but as a professionally worded email that bypassed the social media frenzy. The sender was a woman named Sarah Jenkins, an investigative journalist for a national online news publication. The subject line was simple: your story. The email was cautious, respectful, and direct. She wrote that she had seen the video, but that she was more interested in the context, in the years that led up to that single violent minute. She saw what the millions of commenters had missed. This was not a spontaneous event, but a conclusion. We would like to offer you a platform to tell your story in your own words, she wrote. We can guarantee your complete anonymity if you prefer. Anonymity. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. It was the choice a victim would make. But I was not a victim anymore. I was a curator, an archivist. Anonymity would protect me, but it would obscure the truth. It would make the story a generic cautionary tale, and in doing so, would protect him. I called her. Ms. Jenkins, I said, my voice level as a surveyor's line. This is Claire Monroe. I received your email. She sounded surprised that I had called directly. Claire, thank you for reaching out. I can only imagine how overwhelming this must be for you. I am managing, I said, cutting through the pleasantries. I will agree to an interview. I will provide you with documentation, photographs, and the original unedited video files. But I have one condition, a non-negotiable term. Okay, she said. Her journalistic instincts peaked. What is it? You will not blur his face, I said. You will not redact his name. You will not refer to him as the stepfather, or a man from Ohio. His name is Rick Monroe. You will use it. You will show him. There was a moment of silence on the line, as she processed the implications. That's a bold position, Claire. It opens you up to a lot. I'm aware, I said. For 20 years, my face was the one that had to be perfect for the camera, the one that had to smile, the one that had to hide the truth. Now it's his turn to be in the picture. This was not a negotiation. It was a statement of terms. After a beat, she agreed. As Sarah and I began to correspond, exchanging encrypted files and setting up a time for a recorded interview, Rick made his predictable move. The denial came via a long, rambling post on the Milford Community Facebook page, a digital town square rife with gossip and judgment. A former high school classmate sent me a screenshot. Rick's post was a masterpiece of victimhood and technological paranoia. He wrote that he was the target of a vicious smear campaign orchestrated by his troubled and unstable stepdaughter. The video, he claimed, was a complete fabrication. It's what they call a deep fake, he wrote, using the term with the clumsy authority of someone who had just Googled it. It's made with AI, computer graphics, to make me look like a monster. I have never and would never lay a hand on my daughter. All I have ever done is love and provide for her. It's what they call a deep fake, he wrote, using the term with the clumsy authority of someone who had just Googled it. It's made with AI, computer graphics, to make me look like a monster. I have never and would never lay a hand on my daughter. All I have ever done is love and provide for her. It was a plausible defense for an audience that didn't understand the technology. For a moment, reading his desperate, self-pitying words, I felt a flicker of the old fear. What if they believed him? What if his lie was more powerful than my truth? But then the analyst in me took over. A lie is just a poorly constructed dataset, and I had the source code of the truth. I emailed Sarah. Rick is claiming the video is an AI-generated fake. I am sending you a link to a secure folder. Inside, you will find the 2 original uncompressed video files from my birthday, one from my phone, one from the camera in the cake. You will also find a 3rd file, a screen recording of me exporting the files directly from the devices, demonstrating their uninterrupted chain of custody. The metadata is intact and verifiable. My professional background is in forensic image analysis. I've included my CV. Tell your tech team to have a field day. I attached the link. Checkmate. The article went live the following Tuesday. Sarah had given me a heads up an hour before it was published. I sat at my laptop, a fresh cup of coffee cooling beside me, and watched it appear on the publication's homepage. The title was perfect, a distillation of my entire life's work. The Smiling Daughter, a story of abuse hidden in family photos. The article was sharp, cold, and factual. It was my story told with the clinical precision I had provided. It included the high-definition video, now verified as authentic. It featured a selection of the photos from my archive, the graduation picture, the Florida vacation shot, placed alongside the scanned receipts and medical notes. Each image was a piece of evidence. Its caption a cold indictment. My smile, repeated over and over, became more and more grotesque with each exhibit. The story laid the truth bare, not as a melodrama, but as a case file. The impact in Milford was immediate and seismic. The viral video had been a shockwave of gossip, but the article was an earthquake that cracked the foundations of the town's willful ignorance. Rick wasn't just a monster in a viral video anymore. He was their neighbor, the friendly construction supervisor who coached Little League, the man whose perfect family photos they had liked on Facebook for years. The first real consequence came via a text from that same high school classmate. It was a screenshot of an internal memo from Rick's construction company. In light of the serious allegations and the ongoing media attention, Mr. Rick Monroe has been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. He had been suspended. His identity, the one thing he valued above all else, his reputation as a good, hard-working family man, was being publicly dismantled. The photos he had used to build his life were now being used to demolish it. That evening, my mother called. I knew it was her. Even though the number was blocked, it was the only call that could possibly matter anymore. I answered and held the phone away from my ear, bracing myself. The sound was not a scream this time. It was a ragged, guttural sob. The sound of a person who had been completely broken. Claire, she choked out, her voice shredded with tears. They took his keys, his company truck. His friends won't answer his calls. You did this. You've killed him. I hope you are happy. You've killed your stepfather. I hope you are happy. I listened to her grief. A grief not for my years of pain, but for the man who had inflicted it, for the comfortable life that was now incinerated. The accusation hung in the air. Her last, most pathetic attempt to land a blow, to make me feel an ounce of the guilt that was consuming her, but the guilt was gone. There was no space left for it. No, Mom, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion at all. He did that to himself before I was 10 years old. I just finally developed the pictures. I hung up the phone. I did not feel happiness. I did not feel triumph. I felt a quiet, profound sense of order being restored. The public humiliation was a necessary step, a consequence he had earned 1,000 times over. But I knew this wasn't the end. The real revenge, the true poetic justice, was never about a news article or a lost job. Those were just appetizers. The main course had always been about the one thing he held most sacred, the ritual of the family celebration. It was about the birthday cake. He had put my smiling, bruised face on a cake to celebrate his control. The score wouldn't be settled until his next birthday. And this year, I would be the one bringing the cake. I would choose the photo. I would write the inscription. The final act had yet to be staged, and this time, I was the director. The month that followed was a study in silence. From my apartment in Columbus, I observed the fallout in Milford through the detached lens of social media and the occasional clipped text from my high school classmate. Rick had become a ghost in his own town. He was no longer seen at the diner for breakfast or at the hardware store on Saturdays. The digital whispers followed him everywhere, rendering him invisible. The Monroe house, once a stage for performative happiness, had become a fortress, its curtains perpetually drawn. The silence from my mother was the most profound of all. After the screenshot, she had sent no more texts, made no more calls. It was the silence of a collapsed government, a territory of shame and ruin she could no longer defend. I did not reach out. I spent that month working, sleeping, and refining the final exhibit of my archive. I was not waiting for an apology. I was waiting for a summons. I knew it would come. The ecosystem of their lives was predicated on my participation. Even as the destroyer of their world, I was still a necessary component of it. The call, when it finally happened, was on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Claire. My mother's voice was thin, a reedy, fragile thing I barely recognized. The fight was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out exhaustion. I'm here, I said. It's Rick's birthday on Saturday, she said, the words coming out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would lessen their weight. He's not doing well. Claire, he wants to see you. He wants to talk, to try and make things right, to make peace. Make peace. The words were so absurd, so laughably inadequate, that I almost felt a spark of pity for her. She was still trying to use the old language, the vocabulary of a world that no longer existed. She was trying to put a band-aid on a demolition site. Rick didn't want peace. He wanted leverage. He wanted a new photo, a picture of a reconciled family that he could use to start rebuilding his shattered reputation. He needed me to smile for the camera one last time. Okay, I said. The single word seemed to stun her into silence. I imagined her on the other end, phone clutched in her hand, having prepared for a battle, only to find the opposing army had already surrendered. You'll come, she stammered. Yes, I said. I'll be there. And don't worry about a cake, I added. I'll bring one. I let the pause hang in the air for a beat before ending the call before she could reply. My promise to bring the cake was not a peace offering. It was a declaration of war. The following day, I called the one and only decent bakery in Milford. The woman who answered, Mrs. Gable, had made every single one of my birthday cakes since I was 6. Her voice was warm and familiar. Milford Bakery. This is Eleanor. Hi, Mrs. Gable. It's Claire Monroe. A fractional, almost imperceptible hesitation. Claire. Honey, it's so good to hear your voice. It's been a while. She knew. It has, I said pleasantly. I'd like to order a cake for Saturday. It's for Rick's birthday. This time, the silence was longer. Oh, she said finally. Well, that's lovely. I'd like a photo cake, I continued, my voice betraying nothing. I have a specific picture I'll email to you, and I have an inscription I'd like written underneath it in red icing. Can you do that? Of course, honey. Anything you want. What should it say? Smile for the camera. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the gossip and speculation aligning into a terrifying kind of clarity. After a moment of what I could only assume was stunned silence, she cleared her throat. Red icing. Got it. I'll have it ready for you Saturday morning. The photo I emailed her was a classic. It was from Rick's 50th birthday a few years prior. He was standing on the back patio, a beer in one hand, tongs in the other, beaming at the camera. It was the very picture of the proud, benevolent suburban king, master of his domain. It was the face he showed the world, the lie he had built his entire life around. My final preparation was more delicate. I took the original verified video file for my birthday and loaded it onto a tiny thumb-sized USB drive. I also took the news article Sarah Jenkins had written, formatted it into a tiny multi-page document, and printed it on high-quality photo paper. I sealed both the drive and the miniature article inside a small, vacuum-sealed plastic pouch, the kind used for preserving food. It was a small, dense packet of truth, waterproof and ready for delivery. When I arrived at the bakery on Saturday, Mrs. Gable wouldn't meet my eye. She simply pushed the heavy white box across the counter. As I paid, she looked up, her expression a mixture of fear and something that looked almost like admiration. "You take care, Claire," she whispered. I drove to the house, the cake box sitting on the passenger seat like a bomb. This time, there was no pretense of a party. The house was unnaturally quiet, the air thick with the tension of a ceasefire. They were both in the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the sofa, looking like two shipwreck survivors on a barren shore. Rick stood up as I entered. He had lost weight. His face was sallow, the jovial ruddiness replaced by a grey, pasty pallor. He tried to manufacture a smile, but it was a pained, ghastly thing. "Claire," he said, his voice raspy. "Thanks for coming." I placed the cake box on the coffee table with a soft thud. "Happy birthday," I said, my voice neutral. He gestured toward the box. "You really brought a cake." He was trying for a light, teasing tone, but it cracked with desperation. He saw the cake as a prop, a sign that I was willing to play my part again. As I lifted the lid, revealing his own smiling face staring up from the sugary surface, his forced smile widened into something more genuine. He saw the photo, the familiar image of his better self. And for a moment, he thought he was winning. "At least you still have your sense of humor," he said, chuckling, relieved. I looked from the smiling man on the cake to the broken man standing before me. I read the inscription out loud, my voice ringing with a cold, clear resonance in the silent room. "Smile for the camera." His smile faltered. He finally saw the sarcasm, the venom hidden in the sweet frosting. He looked at me, a flicker of the old anger returning to his eyes. "Oh, this one's for the family album," I said, my own lips curling into a smile that was all sharp edges. And then I reached into my bag. I did not pull out a gift. I pulled out a small, sleek, portable projector. My mother gasped. Rick's eyes widened. Confused, I walked over to the blank beige wall opposite the sofa, the same wall where a large framed family portrait used to hang. I placed the projector on a side table, plugged it in, and aimed the lens at the empty space. I turned back to them. Their faces were studies in dawning horror. This was not part of the script. "This was an ambush, you know," I said conversationally as I connected the USB drive to the projector. "I've been thinking a lot about our family albums, about all the pictures. It seems like we never quite captured the full story." I hit play. The wall lit up, and the kitchen from my 32nd birthday filled the room. Life-sized, there we were, projected onto the very fabric of the house. The scene played out in absolute silence, my voice, his taunt, his approach. The light from the projector flickered across their faces, illuminating their disbelief. Then came the slap. It was silent on the screen, a ghostly pantomime of violence. But in the dead quiet of the living room, it felt as deafening as a gunshot. My mother made a small, strangled noise and crumpled into the cushions of the sofa, as if her bones had dissolved. Rick staggered back a step, his hand flying to his mouth, his face ashen. The video played on, showing my mother's shriek, my bloody lip, my final quiet statement, a 30-second loop of their damnation playing over and over on the wall of their home. Rick stared at the looping image of his own hand striking my face, his mind seemingly unable to process the reality of it. He looked from the wall to me, his expression a chaotic mess of rage, fear, and utter incomprehension. "You," he stammered, his voice a choked whisper. "You recorded it. You planned it. You ruined everything." The accusation was so pure, so perfectly emblematic of the man he was, that it almost felt like a parody. He was the author of all this pain. Yet in his mind, he was the victim. The family wasn't ruined when he hit me. It was ruined when I recorded him hitting me. I picked up the remote and stopped the video, plunging the room back into a dim, suffocating silence. I looked at the man who had haunted my life, now just a hollowed-out shell, his power extinguished. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness, cold and precise. "I didn't ruin anything. I just stopped pretending." I let the words hang in the air, a final verdict delivered in the ruins of his kingdom. I just stopped pretending. I did not stay to watch the cake melt. I left the projector running. The silent, looping horror of his violence playing on the wall of the home he had built on a foundation of lies. I left my mother crumpled on the sofa, a casualty of a war she had refused to fight. I walked out the front door, leaving the ruins behind me, and did not look back. I didn't need to. I had already documented them. I found out later that my sister, Emily, had been there. She had been standing in the shadows of the upstairs hallway, drawn downstairs by the sudden, terrifying silence. She had watched the entire scene unfold, her phone in her hand, its camera recording through the banisters. She, who had lived her entire life in the collateral damage of his rage and my mother's fear, had finally found her own weapon. It was her finger that hit upload. It was her anonymous account that gave the world the second act. The video of the projector, their shattered faces bathed in the light of their own crime, went online before I had even reached the highway. She gave it a title, a hashtag that would become a global rallying cry, #SmileForTheCamera. If the first video was a spark, the second was a wildfire. It was no longer just a clip of an ugly domestic dispute. It was a narrative. It had a setup, a confrontation, and a climax. The world saw a calculated, cold-blooded act of psychological warfare. A daughter using her abuser's own tactics against him. They saw his pathetic, stammering denial, not as a defense, but as a confession. The hashtag trended worldwide for 48 hours. The story was no longer just about me. It was about every person who had ever been told to smile through their pain. The real-world consequences were swift and brutal. The Milford police, who had been dragging their feet, citing a lack of cooperative witnesses, could no longer ignore the public pressure. My classmate sent me a photo of a police cruiser parked in the driveway of the house. Rick was brought in for questioning. While no charges were immediately filed, the wheels of justice grind slowly and require more than viral videos. The social and professional verdict was instantaneous. His construction company, which had put him on leave, now faced boycotts and protests at their job sites. Their hand was forced. A crisp corporate press release announced that Rick Monroe's contract had been terminated, effective immediately. His name, once a symbol of local working-class success, was now synonymous with disgrace. The friends who had once clapped him on the back at barbecues now crossed the street to avoid him. His phone calls went unanswered. His world, once a kingdom of his own making, had shrunk to the four walls of a house that was now a prison. He had been socially and economically executed. A week after his birthday, a letter arrived at my apartment. The handwriting was my mother's, the familiar looping cursive that had signed all my childhood permission slips. The envelope was thin, the single sheet of paper inside fragile. "Claire, he's gone. He packed a bag this morning and left. I don't know where he is. The company is gone. The friends are gone. Everything is gone. You did it. You won. I hope you are happy." I read the letter twice. There was no apology, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the truth. There was only the bitter, pathetic language of defeat. She still saw it as a contest, a power struggle between two people, and I had emerged the victor. She was mourning the loss of the life he had provided, not the loss of her daughter's soul. I folded the piece of paper neatly, and held it over the small metal trash can in my kitchen. I almost dropped it in, but stopped. It was, in its own way, a piece of evidence, a final documented admission of her moral bankruptcy. I slid it into a new file in my archive, labeled Correspondence Final PDF. Then I let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. Winning, I said to the empty room, was never the point. That night, I decided it was time for the final entry in the public record. I had taken one last photo before leaving the house on Rick's birthday. As the projector played, as my mother sobbed and he stared in horror, I had quietly taken out my phone. The picture was an artistic masterpiece of decay. In the foreground was the cake, his beaming 50-year-old face, now a grotesque, melting dolly-esque horror. The red icing of the inscription, "Smile for the camera," was bleeding into the white frosting like an open wound. In the background, blurred but unmistakable, was the flickering image of his violence playing on the wall. It was a perfect symbolic representation of his entire life, a smiling facade melting away to reveal the ugly truth behind it. I posted the photo to the same dormant social media account. The post, which had lain quiet since my first cryptic message, now had millions of followers, a silent, waiting audience. This time, the caption was not a question. It was a final declarative statement. He wanted photos. Now he's everywhere. The internet exploded. The image became a meme, an icon, a symbol of righteous, long overdue retribution. The share count climbed with dizzying speed. 1 million, 3 million. By the next morning, it had been shared over 5 million times. My photo, my final piece of evidence, was now one of the most seen images on the planet. Rick Monroe, the man who had craved respect and admiration, had achieved a level of fame he could never have dreamed of. He was now immortal, his legacy forever cemented as a monster. The final, unexpected consequence of my campaign came in the form of an email from a national advocacy organization, a group that worked with survivors of domestic abuse. They weren't interested in the salacious details of the story. They were interested in the methodology. They had seen what Sarah Jenkins had seen. This was not an act of passion, but a long, meticulously planned operation. They wanted me to be the face of a new media campaign, one focused on the power of documentation, on empowering victims to become the archivists of their own stories. I agreed to a single press conference to launch the initiative. I stood at a podium, not unlike the one in my office. But this time, the audience was not a room full of insurance adjusters, but a sea of cameras. Their lenses like 100 unblinking eyes, the flashes, once a source of terror, were now a source of power. I was in control of the light. I did not tell my story again. The world already knew it. Instead, I offered a new thesis, a final recontextualization of my life's work. I leaned into the microphone, the room falling silent. I looked directly into the cameras, into the eyes of the world, and I delivered the only statement that mattered. Some people are forced to hide their bruises, I said, my voice steady, cold, and clear. I framed mine. 1 year later, the noise had faded. The hashtags were buried in the digital sediment of 1,000 other fleeting outrages. The news cycle had moved on. Rick was a ghost, a name occasionally resurrected in true crime podcasts or sociological essays about viral justice. The gallery was a stark white cube in the city's arts district. The air inside was cool, still, and smelled faintly of paint and antiseptic. There was no music, only the soft shuffling footsteps of the attendees and the low murmur of hushed voices. This was not a party. It was a wake. The invitation had been minimalist, sent to a curated list of journalists, artists, critics, and representatives from the advocacy group I now worked with. The title of the exhibition was printed in a simple sans serif font on the gallery's main wall, The Smile Archive. I had curated the exhibition with the same clinical precision I had used to build the case file. The gallery was my final physical folder. The photos were hung with generous space between them, each one a specimen under glass. They were not the posed, glossy family portraits from my childhood. These were different. They were all stills captured and extracted from the hours of video footage I had secretly recorded over the years. They were grainy, poorly lit, and full of the raw, ugly truth of motion blur and digital artifacting. Each piece was a study in the subtle architecture of fear. One large print titled simply, Duration 8.3 seconds, showed a close-up of my mouth stretched into a smile at a Thanksgiving dinner. The pixels were large enough to see the minute tremor in the corner of my lip, the muscle fatigue of holding a lie for too long. Another, gaze-averted study too, was a portrait of my eyes. Looking just past the lens, their surface flat and reflective, completely disconnected from the cheerful laugh frozen on the lower half of my face. There were photos of hands, his hand, a blur of motion entering the frame, my mother's hands twisting a dish towel in the background, my own hands clenched into fists just below the edge of a dinner table. There were no captions explaining the context of abuse. The photos were presented without comment, their clinical titles forcing the viewer to become the analyst, to search the pixels for the story. The collective effect was deeply unsettling. The room hummed with a quiet, dawning horror as the attendees moved from piece to piece, their faces grim. They were seeing what I had seen my whole life. The profound, terrifying disconnect between the performance of happiness and the reality of survival. In the center of the main wall, commanding the entire space, was the exhibition's centerpiece. It was the only photograph in pristine, high-resolution color. It was the photo I had taken on Rick's final birthday, the melted cake. It was hung alone, illuminated by a single harsh spotlight that made the garish colors of the frosting seem lurid and violent. His beaming 50-year-old face, the face of the lie, was a grotesque, melting caricature. My own 10-year-old face, printed on the cake I had brought to my own party months earlier, was barely visible beneath the smear of red icing. It was an image of innocence, desecrated twice over. It was the thesis of the entire collection. I stood near the back of the room, watching people watch my life. I felt a strange detachment, the quiet satisfaction of a curator whose exhibition has been perfectly mounted. A woman with a press badge, the art critic from a major newspaper, approached me. She had been staring at the cake photo for a long time. "It's a powerful, devastating collection," she said, her voice low. "But I have to ask, the centerpiece, why the cake?" I turned my gaze from her to the photograph on the wall. I thought of the sugary sweetness, the childish celebration, the way he had presented my face to me as something to be consumed, a symbol of a past he thought he still owned. The answer was simple, clean, and sharp as a shard of glass. Because that's where he thought I was sweetest. A small, sharp intake of breath was the only sound she made. The words fell into the quiet room like a stone into a deep well, and the murmuring stopped. A complete, profound silence descended upon the gallery. Every head turned, first to me, then to the photograph of the ruined cake. In that moment, they all understood. They understood the layers of symbolism, the brutal, bitter irony. They saw the whole story in that one spoiled image. And in that sudden, absolute stillness, I saw her at the edge of the crowd, a silhouette in the wide gallery doorway, half hidden in the shadows of the hall. It was my mother. She was wearing a coat, her purse clutched in her hands like a shield. She looked smaller than I remembered, insubstantial. She stood there for a long moment, looking not at the art, but at me. Her face an unreadable mask of something. Regret, fear, self-pity. It didn't matter. She did not step inside. I met her gaze across the silent room. There was no anger left in me, no hatred. There was nothing. I felt the last frayed thread of expectation, the faint residual hope for an apology that had lingered in some deep, unlit corner of my heart, simply snap. The archive had done its work. The truth was on the walls, witnessed, acknowledged, and understood. Her words were no longer required. Her absolution was irrelevant. I did not need her to say she was sorry anymore. The photographs were saying it for her. She held my gaze for another second, then turned and melted back into the shadows she had come from. I turned my back on the crowd and walked to the large blank wall at the far end of the gallery, a space I had reserved for the final installation. Someone handed me a single, thick piece of white chalk as planned. The chalk felt cool and solid in my hand. I faced the wall and, in clean, deliberate letters, I wrote the collection's final caption, the thesis statement I had earned the right to declare. Every bruise deserved a caption. The words were stark and white against the dark grey paint. My work was finished. The archive was complete. I placed the chalk on a small, designated shelf. And without looking back at the crowd or the art, or the empty doorway where my mother had stood, I walked towards the exit. As I left, I heard the sound that had once been the soundtrack to my fear, a sudden, blinding series of flashes, the rapid-fire clicking of a dozen camera shutters. But this time, they were not aimed at my face, demanding a smile. They were aimed at my back, capturing the image of the artist who had just walked away from her finished work, leaving the truth, brilliant and terrible, hanging on the walls behind her. The doors to the gallery were scheduled to close at 9. At 8:45, when the crowd had thinned to a dedicated core of critics, artists, and silent, watchful strangers I recognized as fellow survivors, I moved to the center of the room. The low murmur of conversation quieted as I picked up a small black remote. A sense of anticipation, heavy and electric, settled over the space. They thought the exhibition was over. They thought the statement had been made, but every good archivist knows you save the most definitive piece of evidence for the very end. I aimed the remote at the far wall, the same wall where I had written my thesis in chalk. The projector, which had sat dormant and unnoticed on a high shelf, whirred to life. It did not project one of the grainy, artfully curated stills from the exhibition. It projected a video. The image that swam into focus was dim, lit by the unforgiving glare of a single porch light. It was a close-up, a tight, claustrophobic shot of Rick's face captured through the passenger side window of a car, but it was not the face from the birthday cake, nor the smiling mask from the old family photos. This was a face I had never seen before. It was the face of a man completely devoid of power. His skin was grey and loose, his eyes hollowed out, dark pools of bewilderment. He looked lost, pathetic, a king deposed and exiled from his own life. The image was unsteady, as if filmed by a nervous hand. Then my own voice, pre-recorded and amplified by the gallery's hidden speakers, filled the silent room. It was not the voice of a victim. It was the disembodied, clinical voice of a narrator, an analyst presenting her final finding. He thought the photos were the end of the story, my voice echoed, cool and clear. He thought if he could just discredit the images, he could reclaim the narrative. But the archive was never just about the past. On the screen, Rick's tired, confused face seemed to look out at the gallery audience. The video was raw, unedited. It had been filmed 2 months ago, by a private investigator I had hired for this one, final task. My voice-over continued. Each word a slow, deliberate drop of acid. He told everyone it was a performance, a lie, a trick of the light. He demanded a new picture, one that would prove his innocence. My voice paused, letting the weight of the words settle into the room. So, I decided to give him one. A new sound entered the video's audio track, the crunch of footsteps on a gravel driveway. A figure entered the frame, a man in a plain jacket holding a thick manila envelope. Rick's eyes darted toward the man, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, sickening dread. He knew, on some primal level, what was happening. The man said nothing. He simply held out the envelope. My voice returned, a final chilling command that was both a memory and a curse. Smile, Rick. The camera zoomed in, capturing the twitch in his cheek, the way his eyes widened in horror, as he recognized the seal of the county court on the envelope. It's your turn. The camera held steady as Rick's trembling hand took the envelope. It was a court summons, a formal notice of the civil suit I had filed, a suit for years of damages backed by a mountain of verified, unassailable evidence. This was not a viral video. This was a legal document. This was a consequence that could not be dismissed as a deep fake. The video froze on a single, perfect frame, the moment he understood, the moment the last vestiges of his denial crumbled, leaving behind only the stark, ugly truth of his absolute and irreversible defeat. His mouth was half open, his eyes wide and vacant, his face a perfect mask of ruin. It was the last photograph, the one I had worked my entire life to capture. The projector clicked off. The speakers fell silent. And then every light in the gallery was extinguished. The room was plunged into an absolute, disorienting darkness. The audience gasped, a single collective intake of breath. For a full 10 seconds, there was nothing. No light, no sound, just the darkness, and the lingering afterimage of Rick's destroyed face burned onto the back of every eyelid in the room. I stood in the center of that darkness, invisible. I could feel the presence of the crowd around me, their shared, stunned silence. I raised the camera that had been hanging around my neck, an old, heavy 35mm film camera, the kind that needed a real powerful flash. It was not a digital tool for capturing data. It was an instrument for making a statement with light. I aimed the lens not at a wall, not at a piece of art, but out into the darkness, towards the unseen faces of the witnesses. My finger found the shutter button. Click. A single, violent burst of light erupted in the darkness, a miniature sun that bleached the world white for a fraction of a second. In that brilliant, silent explosion, I saw them. All their faces, their wide eyes, their open mouths, all of them captured, all of them framed in my lens. They were no longer just viewers. They were now part of the archive. The flash was a new kind of smile, a fearless, defiant burst of light that pushed back the darkness. It was the opposite of the smile he had demanded, the one that hid in the shadows. This one owned the light. As the spots faded from their vision, as the profound darkness rushed back in, my voice, real this time, not a recording, cut through the silence. It was the only sound in the universe. It was the final caption. I didn't ruin the photos. A beat of perfect silence. I just finished them. The screen goes black. I would love to know where you're tuning in from today. Please drop a comment below and let us know what city or country you're listening from. It's incredible to see how far these stories can travel. Please share any thoughts you have about Claire's journey in the comments as well. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like, as it truly helps us reach more listeners. And finally, if your platform has a hype button or a similar feature, please consider pressing it. Your support helps boost this story so it can be heard by more people who might need to know they are not alone. Thank you again.